Hi, this is Justin Shubo with the National Civic Art Society, and despite my better judgment, this is U.S. Modernist Radio.
Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Oh, I don't care what Mama don't allow, gonna draw mine modern anyhow. Mama don't allow no architecture around here.
Welcome to U.S. Modernist Radio, where we talk and laugh with people who enjoy, own, create, dream about, preserve, love, and hate modernist architecture, the most exciting and controversial buildings in the world. Today, we welcome all the way from across the pond in Northern Ireland, Professor James Stevens Curl. He'd probably rather be down at the Groaning Board hoisting a pint, but we're thrilled to have him on to talk about modernism and his new award-winning book. Across the studio from me, also wishing he could be down at the Groaning Board hoisting a pint, here's your host, George Smart.
Thank you, Tom. And where's my Guinness? Why don't we have Guinness here in the studio?
I'll make a call. Perhaps our guest can, fax us some.
We do try to keep up with past podcast guests, including our good friend Justin Shubo of the National Civic Art Society. Justin's group, based in Washington, D.C., promotes public art and architecture in the classic tradition. Last spring, Justin invited me to attend a lecture by Professor Curl called Making Dystopia, The Strange Rise and Survival of Architectural Barbarism, and I was immediately enthralled. What is architectural barbarism? And will it be catered? What kind of wine goes well with dystopia? Which, for those of you that are driving, means an imagined state of great suffering or injustice.
I think black wine.
Yes, typically totalitarian or post-apocalyptic. I could not make the lecture, but I wondered, what can we modernists do to help? I mean, surely modernist architecture can do something to fight this totalitarian state, right? Surely modernism, heralded as the logical successor to the classic Beaux-Arts, can take on this level of challenge. Surely modernism can, like the Avengers taking on Ultron, join forces with Professor Curl and create a well-reasoned, insightful, and brilliant solution. Well, no, not at all.
Oh?
It turns out, according to Professor Curl, modernists are the barbarians, the bringers of massive destruction, the creation of alien urban landscapes, and a huge waste of resources. Uh-oh.
Uh-oh.
And as the almost now forgotten mid-century philosopher Pogo once said, we have met the enemy, and he is us.
Well.
U.S. Modernist Radio is underwritten by modernist realtor Angela Rohe.
In our ongoing space saga, it's episode V, Revenge of the McMansions.
That's 5.
To you earthlings. It is a dark time for the modernist rebels. Bulldozer ships from the Empire continue to attack modernist houses across the galaxy and turn them into massive Italianate villas. Evading the Empire's fleet, a group of freedom fighters, led by Princess Angela Rohe, establish a base in Palm Springs, just in time for happy hour.
Cheers!
Brad Vader, Darth's half-brother, who went into mortgage banking and obsessed with finding the rebel princess, refuses to further finance modernist construction and only gives loans to houses over 10,000 square feet. Meanwhile, back on Earth, realtor Angela Rohe uses the force of her real estate and architectural training to specialize in modernist houses, advising buyers and sellers on everything from appropriate renovation to the correct use of a lightsaber. Keep the shiny part pointed away from you. Angela Rohe is your special agent. Reach her at angelarohe.com. That's ROEHL or 919-995-0550.
Thank you, Tom.
You're welcome.
A graduate in architecture from Oxford, Professor James Stephen Curl is known internationally for scholarship, penetrating criticisms, lucidity of style, and thorough investigations in the little-known fields of research. He was first chairman of the Oxford Civic Society, founded in 1969, and he has held chairs at 3 universities, has twice been visiting fellow at Peterhouse, University of Cambridge, and his memberships include the Royal Institute of Architects of Ireland, the Royal Institute of British Architects, and the Royal Irish Academy. He has lectured worldwide, and in 2017 he was awarded the President's Medal of the British Academy for his contribution to the study of the history of architecture in Britain and Ireland. Welcome, Professor Curl.
Hello.
So before we get started, let's talk about one thing which I think we have agreement, and that is that Madison Square Garden's replacement of Penn Station was a huge mistake.
A disaster.
Yes.
I was in it recently, and I thought I was in hell. It's appalling. And compared with that wonderful building which was demolished to make way for it, it's a disgrace to the nation, I think. A great loss to one of the greatest buildings of American culture.
What do you think had people tear down that wonderful Penn Station?
Well, it's very interesting that in the vanguard of the destroyers was Walter Gropius. I suppose it showed up the shabbiness of his own work too much, and therefore he wanted to get rid of it. It
was a pretty massive structure. If you've never been to Penn Station, this is several million square feet, I believe.
Yes, yes, very much so. And it was on the scale of one of the great Roman baths. In fact, it was based on the baths of Caracalla.
A train station?
A train station. This was the old Penn Station in New York City, very similar to Grand Central Station, which fortunately is still around.
Yeah.
They haven't gotten rid of that, and they're not planning to any longer. I think briefly they entertained it, right, Professor, to tear down that one too?
Yeah.
What are the plans for Penn Station currently? I know they're going to bring it back.
Well, I hope so. It would be wonderful. I just hope it's done properly, because it needs a real scholarship. It needs care. It would be a magnificent addition to New York.
Did you get to see the post office building next door, which will be the shell for the new Penn Station?
No, I didn't. I plunged underground immediately to catch a train for Philadelphia. So I didn't have much time to whiz around above ground. I was down in the bowels, as it were.
It is fairly bowelish down there, I must say.
Very
I've done that myself.
Yes.
Congratulations on a recent award for your book, the 2019 Institute of Classical Architecture and Art Arthur Ross Award.
Thank you very much. Yes, it was a very jolly occasion, and I enjoyed it very much, including my trip around various states in America. I was received wonderfully well and very friendly and graciously.
I understand you look quite suave in a tux.
Do I?
Yes.
Oh, that's gratifying to know.
Several commentaries on the internet.
Well, that's the great thing about a tuxedo. They can take the dowdiest man and make him look suave. Not that I'm saying anything about you, sir, but they do work their magic.
Well, that's true.
Where did you go when you were here in the States? How many different cities?
I went to Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., New Orleans, Denver, Colorado, Boston, and I had a look around New England, around Newport and Westport, and enjoyed it all very much.
Yeah, those are great cities.
Yes, terrific. I met some very, very pleasant people. They made sure I saw as much as possible, and I thoroughly enjoyed the whole thing.
Your tour was sponsored in part by the Institute of Classical Architecture and Art.
It was.
Tell us about that group.
Oh, well, it wants to promote the old classical authority. It opposes the worst of modernist destruction. It wants to bring back scholarship and learning into architecture. After all, architecture is the most public art. We're surrounded by it, and yet we're not allowed to criticize it at all, according to the modernists.
Well, Tom, we have to take notes on this as we go along.
Okay.
Well, the loathing for any criticism is quite frightening, because the whole modernist thing is like a pseudo-religious cult.
Well, you know, we've missed out on that, Professor, because where are the orgies? Don't cults have orgies that you can go to?
I don't think an orgy of destruction, perhaps.
I see.
Whoa. And so, where is the modernist lords? You know, where's the spring of?
Well, I suppose this is the centenary of the foundation of that loony asylum, the Bauhaus. 100 years ago, it was founded in Weimar, and Germany at that time was a basket case.
Yeah.
They were having some issues, yes.
My goodness, I mean, how would you like to start every day with an enema?
Was that the practice at the time?
So far, everything's gone fine.
You had an enema and you had garlic paste.
Oh.
So you stank of garlic. This is hardly rational or scientific.
Is that what they did in Germany or at the Bauhaus?
In the Bauhaus.
Ah, I'm glad that practice didn't translate to America.
Well, it wasn't. I think it was toned down by then. But then, of course, the people who went to America had already tried to make accommodation with the National Socialists.
In your view, tell us how modernism started, and how do the big three that you talk about in your lecture, Mies van der Rohe, Walter Gropius, and Le Corbusier, figure in that origin story?
Well, the end of the First World War led to the desire to throw out everything that had happened before. And these people were evangelical in their arguments. They persuaded a lot of people that that was the way forward. I don't think it would have succeeded had they not been associated with pseudo-progress. And progress, of course, as Baudelaire says, is the doctrine of idlers and Belgians.
Ah, the Belgians, also famous for waffles.
Anyway, they achieved respectability through the fact that their proposals for destroying towns were approved of by corporations which wanted to do just like that. The motor lobby, for example, the automobile lobby, saw the proposals of the modernists as the way forward by which they could achieve their aims. They could hardly believe their luck when, after the Second World War, a lot of the proposals became enshrined in law. And so they became gurus. The whole modernist ethos then became compulsory in all the schools of architecture.
So what were some of those...
The world looks in such a mess today.
What were some of those ideas that got enshrined into law? That intrigues me.
Destruction of cities to make motorways, removal of whole populations, the clearance of untidy streets. Le Corbusier hated streets. He wanted to get rid of them altogether. He thought they were untidy. He didn't like the diversity. And all this became enshrined in law. And so we have the flattening of the richness and diversity of cities and towns and the creation of a horrible dystopia where nobody wants to live. Modern architecture makes you ill.
It just seems that you're trying to stop a tidal wave of the surge of the automobile.
I think the automobile has done enormous damage. And I think as the pollution gets worse, I think we need to sort of look at this and say, is this the way forward? Because we're going to destroy ourselves and the earth if we go on behaving the way we're doing.
He has a point.
Yes. Now, how did modernism really start? Did Walter Gropius wake up one morning and go, I'm going to get rid of all ornamentation?
No. The destruction of the whole tradition of architecture was quite deliberate. They wanted to create a tabula rasa, an empty table on which everything would start again. Books were thrown out. In Germany, there were burning books. When Gropius got to America, he had all the historical books removed from the library at Harvard, historical books dealing with architecture.
Wow. I know a lot of librarians that would lay down their lives for that.
Well, quite. Now, there's not much difference, I think, in the two types of totalitarianism. And there's no doubt about it that the man who talked about total architecture was a totalitarian, as was Mies van der Rohe. You know that he put a diaeresis on the E because Mies in German means something that's rather mean and nasty and unpleasant. So he changed his name to Mies and added van der Rohe, which sounds rather grand and reassuringly Dutch.
I think it's like Sean Combs, who changes his name every few years to match his mood.
Puff Daddy.
Yeah.
P. Diddy.
Yeah.
Well, these people probably wouldn't have been listened to had they not had this good fortune to have their ideas embraced after the Second World War. And that became an article of faith almost universally. So we've got really a very deplorable situation now where the planning of the post-war years demonstrates how we've lost the ability to create pleasant places in cities. After all, most people now go on holiday and look at old cities in Italy and so on and so forth. So these places are now becoming overused. And why are they doing that? They're doing that because the modern cities are so unpleasant.
I did wonder about modern cities and scale. I can't imagine a building that's 60 stories tall looking like Penn Station. It seemed like it would have to look like a modern steel and glass building. Or is there something that I'm missing? Is there a classical equivalent of a skyscraper, Professor?
Well, if you look at a lot of the early skyscrapers, late 19th century, early 20th, they have a base in the middle and a top, and they often suggest some kind of plinth and then an intermediate series of floors and then some crowning element. Modernism got rid of all that, so you have sheer walls, so you have problems of downpours, you have problems of wind tunnel effects. The spaces at the bottom of a lot of tall buildings are almost unusable because of wind tunnel effects.
And light.
And light.
Yeah, they create canyons.
Yeah, indeed. Indeed.
Wasn't there a building in London that would reflect the sun so as to barbecue people?
But not quite. It just made cars go on fire.
Oh, is that all? Which, I don't see what your problem is with that.
You see.
Wow.
I hope they fix that.
Oh well, I don't think they'd want to fix it now.
Yeah.
No, they probably closed the street.
Do you own a car?
Yes, I do.
Okay, so you're a driver.
I'm a driver, yes.
How do we make the highway system better?
I think the problem is that if you have an old established urban fabric, to bring motor cars into it, something for which it wasn't designed, you're going to wreck it. So obviously you have to keep the cars out of such places, because if you let them in, you have to destroy them.
And that's what happened in many cities. I can think of Boston, for example.
Yes.
Built that giant throughway through the
Big Dig.
Well, before that,
funnily enough, I was on that only a few weeks ago, and I thought it was horrific. It's done an awful lot of damage, and yet parts of Boston are so pleasant to walk about in and to look at, and yet that thing has done massive destruction, and that's what I'm talking about. When you penetrate like that, you wreck something. And don't forget that traffic tends to expand to fill the space available.
Sure.
So no matter how big you make the thing, you're going to have to make it bigger as the traffic expands. So I think we have to think in terms of a much tighter urban structure. Otherwise, we're just going to spread everywhere and destroy what's left of the earth. But it's what motor cars and aeroplanes and other engines pump out into the air that is causing massive pollution. We know that a lot of people living near very busy roads develop illnesses such as asthma, and even children brought up in such a place become mentally retarded. So there's a problem.
New York, I think, is about to begin, or maybe has already begun, something that was, I heard first in London, a toll to enter the city in an automobile. There's a zone inside which, I forget what it's called.
Entry tax, perhaps?
Yeah, it's something like that. But basically a toll to drive your car into the city.
Yeah, that's right, yeah.
Do you think that's going to help?
Well, it's going to make people think twice about bringing cars into a city. I mean, I wouldn't dream of bringing a car into London nowadays. In the old days, 40 years ago, 50 years ago, you could drive a car in and just leave it on the street and go to whatever you were going to go and drive out again. It would be absolutely impossible now because of the density of traffic. But I think one has to have some punitive tax system to stop people bringing their cars in. But, of course, at the same time, you have to then provide a very reliable public transport system.
Yep.
As you have in the city of Vienna, for example, has a most wonderful
Yes, it does.
transport system with the trams, the buses, the trains. Everything is related and links up. And it's cheap as well.
So let's get back to post-war. We've got Mies van der Rohe, Walter Gropius, Le Corbusier. What about Marcel Breuer? Was he a major influence or just
Breuer,
kind of a...
Well, he was mostly a furniture designer, but he did the occasional piece of architecture. He wasn't one of the people who forced the issue and became a kind of deity, a false deity, which is what happened to people like Le Corbusier, who incidentally always referred to himself in the third person. He said he was above criticism and all that sort of thing. He had a vast opinion of himself. And I think it's very interesting that dictators like Lenin, Stalin, Molotov, and Le Corbusier give themselves pseudonyms.
Yes.
His name was Jeanneret, Charles-Edouard Jeanneret.
Oh, so that's not his birth name?
No.
Oh.
He made up a name, too.
He just invented it. He just gave himself a pseudonym to identify himself as some sort of deity.
Now, how did they acquire such influence so quickly? It had to be more than just the automobile and road construction and oil lobby.
Well, I think that it became a cult. It became a kind of pseudo-religious cult. And a cult over-eggs personalities. It won't accept any criticism. It becomes self-referential. It has its own tame intellectuals writing false histories to show that it was a seamless development from the past, when in fact it wasn't. It was a complete disruption. And eventually this becomes accepted. It's like really a fundamentalist pseudo-religion. And that's a very dangerous thing, because once it has its believers, nobody can criticize it. You have to accept it. It's stuffed down the throats of students, and nobody can break it. Well, it has to be broken, otherwise we're lost completely.
The movement did have its critics. I think in your presentation, and I may be mispronouncing this name, Sybil Moholy-Nagy was one, and she was married...
Sybil Moholy-Nagy referred to the whole Bauhaus thing as something that was bankrupt. She said it was already bankrupt in Germany, that it was like a tree with poisoned fruit. And Hitler shook the tree, the poisoned fruit fell, and the poisoned seeds were carried to America. And she called modernism, once it took root in America and then was spread back again to Europe, she called it Hitler's revenge. Now, she was part of the Bauhaus.
She was married to a modernist, right?
Fraudulent. Yes, of course she was. She was married to Laszlo Moholy-Nagy. So she knew what the place was like.
So if modernism couldn't stand criticism, what did they do to old Sybil?
I think she got absolutely fed up. But then she was sidelined. You see, she wrote this in the 60s. But her views, they tried to hush her views up. They hardly even mention her now.
Well, it's a good thing we did.
Yes. Yeah, because I thought...
Is she still alive?
No, she passed away, I believe, in the 70s, perhaps? No.
I think so, yeah. Something like that.
Until 69, she taught architectural history and was very popular among the students.
Well, she would be.
She wrote in Progressive Architecture and Architecture Forum, and she had a couple different books, Native Genius and Anonymous Architecture.
Yes,
and
yes,
the Matrix of Man, an illustrated history of the urban environment.
That's correct. She was very, very critical of the kind of bullshit that has been developed as a result of the early work of the Bauhaus in Weimar and its false position as a kind of paradise, when it wasn't. It was a loony bin.
So what was happening to the classicists post-war? Were they meeting in secret underground rooms to plan their strategy?
No, classicism went on, but it was lost, of course, and overwhelmed. It had a false association with the National Socialist regime and with Mussolini and with, of course, the new enemy, the Soviet Union.
You're saying that classicism had this association?
Well, classicism, strict classicism was very much the language for official government buildings in National Socialist Germany and also in the Soviet Union and to a certain extent also in Mussolini's Italy. Although some of the most polished examples of international modernism were in fact built as fascist headquarters in Italy. Giuseppe Tiragni, for example, his work in Como, fascist headquarters, international style modernism, absolutely impeccable example of that style. But the association, or the false association, with these regimes meant that the modernists were falsely associated with democracy, whereas in fact they were all totalitarians and wanted nothing else than to force their views on the rest of the world. But it's also not true to say that the only architecture tolerated in, for example, National Socialist Germany was classical or stripped classicism, because it wasn't. In my book, I show numerous buildings used for factories and so on, which were, in fact, impeccably modernist.
Now, your book has won this award, and I assume is up for several more. Some of your critics, I noticed, have been unreasonably harsh. Did one write that your hands should be smashed?
Oh.
No, that was a tweet, actually.
A tweet? Uh-oh.
That's a form of writing, I guess.
Yeah.
Oh.
Are you on Twitter, Professor?
No.
No, okay.
This was forwarded to me by somebody who had access to it. That kind of criticism is exactly what I expected. And some of the same people criticized Professor Watkin for his book on morality and architecture, which was published in 1977. Exactly the same people, they attacked me because they cannot abide any criticism of what they believe in, their cult, in other words.
Would this be somebody like Stephen Bailey?
Indeed.
I would pay to see the two of you debate each other.
Pointless. Absolutely pointless.
Stephen Bailey, he's been a guest on our show in the past.
Has he?
Yes.
Yep.
As well as Michael Hammond. Do you know him?
Michael? No, I don't.
World Architecture. And Tom Dykhoff?
No, I don't know him.
Okay.
No.
There's been a significant failure in modernism, both in the UK and here, in housing projects, specifically those designed for large numbers of people. Robin Hood Gardens in London.
Yes, that's just been demolished.
Is it pronounced Hume Crescents?
Yes, Hume, yes.
And then, of course, we have our own Pruitt-Igoe in St. Louis.
Indeed, yes.
We did.
Yeah. Yes. So how much of this was architecture and how much of it was just incompetence on the part of government?
Well, it's a bit of both. Most of it was architecture. That Corbusian vision of vast slabs, putting people in the air, raised walkways, high-level walkways, and all that sort of thing, that was all part of the orthodoxy of modernist planning. And when it was applied with ferocity to all those places that you mentioned, it very quickly created hell on earth. People hated living there. The lifts, or elevators, as I think you call them, became, in fact, urine-soaked, horrific places and were always breaking down. The high-level walkways became places for muggers to
mug
people,
yes.
Steal their stuff. And the buildings themselves leaked. They grew mushrooms inside. They were uninhabitable and had to be demolished. So what sense does it make to spend billions of pounds on these huge, expensive schemes and then have to demolish them long before their costs have been paid off?
But wasn't one of the problem, I mean, we talked about Pruitt-Igoe a few weeks ago, that
was
the original
Missouri, wasn't it?
Yes, in St. Louis?
St. Louis?
Yeah, that it was sort of value engineered down from the original concept into something into what it was, which was, as you described, a towering concrete blocks with urine-soaked elevators, but that originally it was designed to have more open space.
Open space and more community spaces where you'd have grocery stores and barbershops and other kinds of social gathering spaces, libraries and so forth. And in most cases, all those community experiences were taken out of the budget by the time the places were built.
They got redlined.
Yeah. Yes, well, there is always that. Things get watered down. But the problem is that with all the sort of community amenities in the world being added, it wouldn't save the thing in the end from being a horror story, that the buildings themselves were rotten. And I think that if you take Hume in Manchester, they called those crescents after great architects of the past. It was a kind of false connection with the past to give it a kind of spurious respectability. And within 7 years, it became one of the most dysfunctional housing estates in the whole of Europe. Now, that doesn't make any sense at all, does it? Because they decanted people from perfectly respectable, decent houses, which they didn't like because they weren't modern. It was all a question of packaging. And they moved them into these vast crescents, they were called, against their will. And in no time at all, it became apparent the thing was a total failure.
And why were they moving people out of their other homes? Was it
because it was the fashion at the time to destroy the past. We had to have an image of modernity. The image of modernity was that provided by the modernist orthodoxy. Tall blocks, vast open spaces, usually badly designed, ill-planned, etc., etc. And in no time at all, it became a dystopia.
I don't know how it was in the UK, but in the United States, people were being moved not from very respectable housing, but from really awful slums into these tall buildings. Let's rewind the time capsule here. If you were the prime minister, Professor, in 1965, and you have to make decisions about public housing, what would you do instead of modernism? How would you go forward?
Well, don't forget that in the 1960s, I was carrying out surveys of perfectly sound 19th century buildings which were structurally fine and could have been brought up to date with sensitivity and intelligence. Instead of that, they were demolished. System building tower blocks were erected in their place with windswept open spaces which couldn't really be used because they were so unpleasant. Within the last few years, those buildings themselves have had to be pulled down. What I would have done is I would have put a lot more money into careful conservation of what we had. We had some splendid buildings which, however, were deliberately de-roofed to stop people living in them because the intention was to create a modernist package, something that looked modern. There was nothing wrong with the buildings. They could have been restored. They could have been brought up to date. Now, there were rotten buildings as well, fine, but the losses of good quality building, certainly in these islands, was colossal and a huge waste of very scarce resources.
And wasn't it also a matter of space, too? Because the buildings that modernism replaced tended to be low-rise, 3- or 4-story buildings, and they were trying to cram more people in a smaller space.
Well, if you cram more people into a smaller space, it doesn't work, because what you do is that you create unusable open space around the bottom of the buildings. You isolate people in the tower blocks. The lifts don't work. People pee in them or worse, or break them. And you have terrorized people who are afraid to go out. What sort of sense does that make? If you had lower density in streets and squares and that sort of thing, there is a natural kind of policing by the community which does not consist of isolated pockets, people interact in a much more sensible way. They can't do that if they're tucked up, inaccessible in some flat where they're too terrified of coming out or can't come out because the lifts don't work.
But isn't the baby boom partly to blame for, it was an increase in density, population density, that couldn't be stopped?
There was certainly an increase of population, but there was also a huge increase of population in the 19th century. And the kind of environment that was created towards the end of the 19th century, when the population exploded, was perfectly acceptable. In fact, the kind of environment that was created then is greatly sought after by people nowadays who much prefer housing like that to the sort of thing that the failed modernists provided, most of which has had to be demolished.
Well, let's talk about that. Tell us about Poundbury, which has been a successful classical community started in 1989.
Well, that was an experiment, a very small experiment on the outskirts of Dorchester. It was under the aegis of the Prince of Wales, and various classical architects were involved, traditional architects were involved, John Simpson, Robert Adam, etc., etc.
Leon Krier or Krier?
Yes, Leon Krier was involved as a planner. He's from Luxembourg. He opposed the theories of modernist town planning, which he said were destroying cities, and I entirely agree with him. And although it's very small in scale and is still being developed, it seems to be a very desirable place for people want to live there. But of course, I think that the principles of small scale, proportion and so on could be applied with great benefit to much larger schemes backed by government and local authorities.
That seems to be the question of how to do this inside cities where land is incredibly scarce and more expensive. Seems like you can only go up.
Well, if you look at a lot of cities, there's an awful lot of waste space. Now, for example, I can point to cities in these islands where there are vast acreages of derelict land or land that has been formerly used, which has now been abandoned. I was appalled when I took the train from New York to Philadelphia and then down from Philadelphia to Washington, D.C. through Baltimore to see on either side of the tracks such enormous areas of dereliction, derelict factories, derelict land, wasteland, where once, of course, there had been heavy industry. Now, you're very fortunate in America because you've got vast acreages. We don't. We're very overcrowded in these islands. We should be using our land much more sensibly, a much tighter kind of development, not spread out. And I think that if you have a kind of linear development with a series of spines off it, fed by public transport, it would make a lot more sense than going up and having a dysfunctional society instead.
Well, Professor, we don't really have a great train system yet.
No, I know you don't.
So we've got a long way to go to catch up with the UK.
Well, you did once have a good train system, but of course it's been very badly hit by the vested interests of the motor industry, hasn't it?
Indeed.
Yep. And it's probably at its best in the Northeast, from Boston down to Washington. But we are actually south of that in North Carolina, and the
almost
train
no
here,
one takes the train.
Yeah, it's an anachronism almost.
Yeah.
You should Google Poundbury. It will be completed in 2025, about which time it will be home to an estimated 4,500 people, which will increase the population of the area by about 25%.
Yeah.
And then the government will leave.
You see, Dorchester is quite a small county town. I mean, it's a very, very tiny place. Dorset itself is a county with a very relatively small population. But yes, Poundbury does represent a significant increase in those terms. But what has been created is actually quite pleasant and is very humane in terms of its scale.
Now, I don't know if you've read this or not, but Leon Krier says that he and Prince Charles, once they finish Poundbury, will embark on their ultimate project. He says, "We are going to build a small modernist town and show them how to do it."
But Prince Charles, not a fan.
Right, but that's the idea is that once they've done Poundbury and done it right, they're going to create a modernist town and show how that could be done well.
Well, I hope it comes off. I think that, of course, there are a lot of people who have deliberately been gunning for them. They've had a press that's not exactly been friendly towards them. And, of course, that press is controlled by the modernists, the Modernist Establishment.
Fake news?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, Tom and I own several networks here in the in the United States. We control all the radio and TV and internet in this town, and it's
raking it in.
It has not benefited us hardly, but we enjoy being the overlords of the
all
area.
That we survey.
Yes, of all we survey.
I get the impression that you're rather more open-minded than some.
We try. We do. We do try that.
We all try.
Keep telling yourself that.
So I wanted to ask you, of all the modernist buildings in the world, and you're quite familiar with a number of them, which do you dislike the least?
The best of the worst?
Mm-hmm. Right.
Well, I mean, I think the whole thing has been a catastrophe.
We know that, but certainly, like, one of these buildings has resonated with you in a small way, I would think. Maybe not.
I think that's very difficult. I mean, I really think that one of the problems with modernism is it doesn't have a coherent language. It doesn't mean anything. It's devoid of meaning at all. If you look at those buildings at the campus of Illinois,
IIT, yes,
which Mies van der Rohe designed, the boiler room uses the same language as the chapel, as the lecture halls, etc., etc. There's no signal. They don't give any signal of meaning. In other words, I think they're empty, totally empty of any significance, meaning, resonance at all. I think that nearly everything that Walter Gropius is supposed to have designed, and he didn't design much himself because he couldn't draw, he worked always with other people. I don't think anything of his has stood the test of time at all. It seems to me to be, a lot of it seems to me to be very shabby. It doesn't really work very well.
So no buildings that you dislike the least?
Well, I think that that's really irrelevant. I don't think that my disliking something is important. What I do think is terribly important is that architecture should actually help to make life better. It should improve how you feel about your environment. It shouldn't make you feel depressed or sick like Penn Station nowadays does. I thought it was a horrible place, one of the most awful places I'd ever been in my life.
Well, we're in agreement there.
Yeah.
I was wondering, Professor Curl, are there any settings in which modernist buildings are superior? For example, airports. I'm not sure I'd want my local airport to look like Penn Station.
I think anybody who knows me knows that I hate, with a violent passion, all airports. I think it's the most ghastly way to travel. I wish I could have gone to the States on a ship and come back on a ship, because I think that nothing worse than an airport. I think everybody knows that I detest the places.
But don't they lend themselves more to modern design?
Well, they might lend themselves to modern design, but it doesn't make them any better. They're just horrible places.
So what do we do? Do we not fly?
Well, I think there's another thing. The huge increase in air travel is causing pollution. And pollution is one of the worst things that we're going to have to face. In fact, we should be facing it now, but we're not.
You sound like a Green New Deal.
Well, I think I've got a great deal of sympathy for the Greens, but I think that the way we're going, the evidence is that we're going to poison ourselves and the earth. I pointed out that children brought up near heavy intersections with road transport with the result of pollution suffer from mental defects. And I think that one can look at the the way in which certain species are beginning to disappear. And I think that's all happened within the last 40 years, in my own experience, the loss of hedgerows and that kind of thing. I think we could be in severe trouble. I think, yes, a lot of people travel unnecessarily. If we have all these electronic gadgets of communication, why do we need to travel?
Good question.
Well,
I mean, it sounds like we just need to re-engineer the entire transportation grid, both cars and airports.
I think we do. Yes, I think we need to have drastic change. I think the way we're going is not working, and I think it's going to end up in disaster. And I do wish people would wake up. Some people have, but it's very difficult to get through to politicians. We have to have a disaster before anything will be done.
Well, I think Stephen Bailey actually shares your opinion about the environment. Perhaps the two of you could do a two-man show around the world.
Stephen Bailey, in his so-called review of my book, said that it's a very small step from Walter Gropius to a crap housing estate, and that the vertical gardens of Corbusier simply became slums very quickly, which is what I'd said, and then he proceeds to denounce me.
Ah, how unfair of him.
So he plagiarized.
Oh, no, it was just ridiculous. He made himself look silly.
Well, Professor Curl, thank you so much for joining us. I hope we were not too ruinous to your evening.
No, not at all. No, pleasure to talk to you.
Next time in America, drinks are on us.
I don't know if I'll be going to America again. I'm pretty ancient now. I'm in my 83rd year.
If we come to Ulster, we'll take you out.
Okay.
Thanks for listening. U.S. Modernist Radio is underwritten by Angela Roll, your special real estate agent for modernist houses. 919-995-0550. Okay, take us out, Tom.
Visit usmodernist.org's massive modernist archives to hear past shows, discover 7,000 mid-century houses, and access 2.6 million pages of classic 20th century architecture magazines. U.S. Modernist Radio is produced by Soundtracks Recording Studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. Our theme song was performed by George Smart and Robinson Earl. Guest research is led by Cindy Stratton, not her real name, an enigma to some, feared by others. U.S. Modernist Radio is a production of Modernist Archive, a nonprofit educational archive for the documentation, preservation, and promotion of modernist residential design. I'm Tom Guild. George and I'll be back soon with another barbaric, destructive, illogical, fascist, beneath contempt edition of U.S. Modernist Radio. We're sorry.